In the American Civil War, the term political general is often one of derision. It conjures up images of ambitious, incompetent men who traded political favors for shoulder straps, only to lead their raw, untested troops into disaster. They were the amateurs in a war that was rapidly and bloodily becoming the domain of professionals. Now, we have talked on this podcast before about exceptions to that rule, such as John Alexander Logan, who was a fantastic Union general, one of the best they had, and he was a political general. Today I want to share the story of another one with you, one who's getting some new attention because of a new Netflix series, which I highly recommend, by the way. His name was James Abram Garfield. He wasn't a West Point graduate. He was a professor of classics. He wasn't a hardened soldier. He was a preacher for the disciples of Christ. He had never commanded men in the field. He was the 27-year-old president of a small Ohio college. By all measures, he should have been one of the war's footnotes, another politician undone by his own ambition. Instead, in a military career that spanned just over 2 years, James Garfield defied the stereotype. He would prove to be one of the Union's most effective volunteer generals, a brilliant strategist, and a genuine war hero. He rose from a greenhorned colonel who had never seen a battle to one of the youngest major generals in the Union Army, a man whose courage in the face of catastrophe would become a part of a national legend. This is the story of that transformation. A story not of a politician playing soldier, but of a scholar applying a lifetime of learning to the brutal art of war. James Garfield's entire life is a study in transformation. He was the last president to be born in a log cabin, entering the world in the frontier poverty of northeastern Ohio in 1831. His father died as the result of a fire on their property when he was just a small boy, leaving his mother to raise the family in near penniless conditions. His first ambition wasn't the classroom, but the sea. He loved the outdoors, like his father. He was good with his fists, but he detested farming. At 16, he ran away from home to work on the canal boats, shuttling commerce between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. This adventure was, for Garfield, a humbling disaster. In just 6 weeks, he fell overboard 14 times. The adventure ended when he caught a severe fever and he was forced to return home. But this failure became the pivotal moment of his youth. While recovering, Garfield vowed to make his way in the world using his brains rather than his brawn. This vow defined the next chapter of his life. He worked as a carpenter and as a janitor in order to pay for his education, eventually attending the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which would later be known, and is known today, as Hiram College. He went on to graduate with honors from Williams College in Massachusetts in 1856. He returned then to the Eclectic Institute as a classics professor, and within a year, at the age of 27, he was made its principal, the equivalent of president at that school. By the time the first shots of the Civil War were fired, James Garfield had become a pillar of his community, a respected college president, an ordained lay preacher, and a practicing attorney. He was the living embodiment of his vow, a man who had built his life on his intellect, on his oratory skills, and on his moral philosophy. In 1859, Garfield's intellectual life collided with the growing national crisis when he was elected to the Ohio State Senate as a staunchly anti-slavery Republican. When Southern states began to secede following the election of Abraham Lincoln, Garfield was uncompromising. He advocated coercing the seceding states back into the Union. For Garfield, the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861 wasn't just a political crisis, it was a moral one as well. His background as a preacher, his convictions as an abolitionist, and his duty as a state senator all pointed to a single, inevitable conclusion. Though his disciples of Christ's faith had pacifist leanings, the act of secession was, to Garfield, a profound sin against both God and the Republic. He famously told his roommate, quote, "I am big and strong, and if my relations to the church and the college can be broken, I shall have no excuse for not enlisting," end quote. Garfield sought a commission, believing that as a leader of men, he was officer material. After an unsuccessful attempt to be elected colonel of the 7th Ohio, the governor of Ohio offered Garfield a commission as a lieutenant colonel for the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry in August of 1861. At the time, the 42nd existed only on paper, so Garfield's first task wasn't to drill soldiers, but to find them. He immediately returned home to the Western Reserve, the community where he was most trusted. His pre-war life now became his single greatest military asset. He recruited as many of his neighbors and former students as he could find. His appeal was so strong that Company A of the 42nd was filled almost entirely with eclectic institute students loyal to their ex-principal. These young men weren't enlisting to follow a soldier. They were following their admired and respected professor, a man they truly did trust with their lives. His recruiting efforts were so successful that he was quickly promoted to full colonel in command of the regiment. Garfield was keenly aware that he was a professor, not a soldier. He had no military experience, and so true to his vow, he set about to learn the art of war with his brain. He studied every book he could find on drill techniques and battle formations and read biographies of Napoleon, absorbing tactics. He was an academic, and he would master this new deadly subject just as he had mastered Greek and Latin. In December of 1861, Garfield's 42nd Ohio was ordered to Kentucky to join the Army of the Ohio under General Don Carlos Buell. Buell, perhaps seeing the young colonel's political connections, quickly gave him an independent command, the 18th Brigade. His mission was to take his 1,500 or so men and drive out a 2,000-man Confederate force led by General Humphrey Marshall out of the Big Sandy River Valley in eastern Kentucky. The campaign was a logistical nightmare from the start. The winter was brutal. Violent rainstorms turned the few roads into impassable mud. And the Big Sandy River, the brigade's only supply line, became a raging torrent clogged with floating debris. Garfield's supplies dwindled, and his men were soon put on half rations. The campaign's defining moment came not in battle, but in a test of Garfield's leadership. With his men starving, he rode back to the town of Catlettsburg in order to secure supplies. He found that no riverboat captain would be persuaded to risk a lunatic voyage up the swollen river. And so Garfield, displaying the absolute authority he now possessed, got his hands on a rickety steamer known as the Sandy Valley. When the terrified captain refused to take the helm, Garfield, the former canal boy who had once dreamed of being a sailor, took the wheel himself. The journey was fraught with danger. At one point, the steamer ran aground. The terrified crew refused to chance the currents. And in an act that would become legend among his men, Garfield himself jumped into a small boat, made fast a line from the banks, and pulled the steamer loose. He puffed into Paintsville at the helm, just in time to feed his hungry soldiers. This single act was the perfect synthesis of his life. The brains of the commander identified the logistical problem, and the brawn of the former canal boy took the personal, physical risk to solve it. The loyalty of the student regiment was now absolute. With his men now fed, Garfield advanced on Marshall. He found the Confederates dug in at a strong defensive position on a high ridge overlooking Middle Creek. Garfield was outnumbered. A conventional frontal assault up the ridge would lead to slaughter. The professor once again chose brains over brawn. He devised a strategy of creative psychological warfare. He began by ordering a small squad of around 20 cavalrymen to dash into the valley and draw fire. This ploy sprung Marshall's trap, revealing the precise location and strength of the Confederate positions without a costly probe. Knowing that he was outnumbered, Garfield decided to make Marshall think he was outnumbered. He ordered his men to march around the mountain and valley below, and as Marshall watched from the ridge, he saw what appeared to be an endless column of Union soldiers marching into position. He was deceived into believing Garfield's force was actually triple of what he expected it to be. This wasn't a strategy from a West Point textbook. It was an intellectual's victory. Marshall, fearing a tragic level of bloodshed from a supposedly superior force and flanked by Garfield's reserves, ordered a hasty retreat. Garfield had won a resounding Union victory at the Battle of Middle Creek, and along with the subsequent Battle of Mill Springs, this cemented Union control of eastern Kentucky. The campaign launched his military and his political career. News spread north of this professor colonel who had won a battle with his wits. At just 30 years old, James Garfield was promoted to brigadier general. After his promotion, Garfield was given command of the 20th Brigade in the Army of the Ohio. In April 1862, his brigade arrived on the second day of the Battle of Shiloh. The main horrific fighting of the first day was over at this point, and the Confederates were in full retreat. Garfield's brigade joined in the chase and exchanged fire with the Confederate rear guard, capturing somewhere around 40 prisoners without suffering any casualties themselves. It was a minor role, but it was his first exposure to the industrial-scale slaughter of major battles that would define the American Civil War. His brigade then participated in the Siege of Corinth. This experience was formative for Garfield, as it was here that he developed his own strategic personality. He became intensely critical of the overly cautious nature of General Henry Halleck, the Union commander, who allowed the Confederate army to escape. Garfield was by his nature intellectually aggressive, and he believed that decisive action would lead to annihilation of the enemy, not slow, cautious sieges. This dissent, a willingness to challenge the old brains of the professional army, would define Garfield's service. However, army life soon took its toll. The summer of 1862 was brutal in the malarial swamps of Mississippi. Garfield succumbed to camp fever and to dysentery, and a severe case of jaundice. This caused significant weight loss, and he was forced to leave the army and return home to Ohio to recuperate. While he was ill, his political friends, recognizing the power of his new war hero status, nominated Garfield for the U.S. House of Representatives. He never did any campaigning, but in the 1862 election, Ohio's 19th district elected him in a landslide. He was now simultaneously a general and a congressman-elect. When his health was restored and before Congress took their seats, Garfield returned to the Army. In February 1863, he was given the role that perfectly suited his talents: Chief of Staff to General William Rosecrans, commander of the Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans was at times a brilliant general, but he also was cautious. He'd been sitting idle for nearly 6 months since his victory at Stones River, driving leaders in Washington crazy. Rosecrans called a meeting of his top generals to discuss an advance, and almost the entire staff of West Point professionals cautioned against it. Garfield, the amateur, disagreed. He wrote Rosecrans a detailed report explaining why an immediate attack would be successful. His argument was pure, it was logical, and it was brilliant. The Confederate Army under General Braxton Bragg was vulnerable because Grant's ongoing siege of Vicksburg meant that no additional rebel troops could be spared. This wasn't just a military decision. It was a lengthy essay-like report that logically listed point by point every reason for their potential success. It was a professor's thesis, and it was irrefutable. Rosecrans, who was an intellectual man himself, was convinced by Garfield's argument. He adopted the plan. The result was the Tullahoma Campaign, one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the American Civil War. Using a series of feints and rapid movements, Rosecrans and Garfield completely outwitted Bragg, driving the Confederates out of all Middle Tennessee with virtually no fighting or casualties. Garfield was lauded as the brains of the Tullahoma Campaign, but this success also revealed his political nature. He grew frustrated with Rosecrans' slowness and wrote secret critical letters to his political mentor, Secretary of the Treasury, Ohio's Salmon P. Chase, undermining Rosecrans, his superior officer. Garfield was a brilliant staff officer, but he was also always a politician. After the triumph of Tullahoma, Rosecrans maneuvered Bragg out of the critical railroad hub of Chattanooga, another victory won with brains. But this time Rosecrans made a fatal assumption. He believed Bragg's army was in a full, demoralized retreat. It wasn't. Bragg had stopped, concentrated his forces, and had been heavily reinforced by troops from Virginia, including General James Longstreet's corps. He was waiting for Rosecrans at Chickamauga Creek. On September 20th, 1863, the second day of the battle, disaster struck. A Union staff officer, riding through the smoke and confusion, falsely reported to Rosecrans' headquarters that he had seen a gap in the Union line. Rosecrans, who was exhausted and hadn't checked the situation for himself, turned to his chief of staff, Garfield, and dictated a fatal order to Brigadier General Thomas Wood: close up on Reynolds as fast as possible and support him. This order instructed Wood to move his division to fill the non-existent gap. General Wood received the order, and he was perplexed. He knew there was no gap. To obey the order meant he would have to pull his entire division out of the line, creating the very gap Rosecrans feared already existed. But Wood had been upbraided in front of his staff by Rosecrans for not moving swiftly enough earlier in the campaign. And so, stung by this public criticism, he chose to obey the flawed order to the letter. He ordered his men to move, and by doing so created a true gap in the center of the Union line. And no sooner had he done that than, by sheer catastrophic coincidence, General Longstreet had launched his assault directly into that spot. The Confederate tide poured through the man-made gap, striking the Union flank, and the Union line was shattered. At this point, the scene at Rosecrans' headquarters dissolved into chaos. The Union right flank collapsed. General Rosecrans himself, believing that all was lost, was swept along with the mobs of fleeing soldiers. An aide saw the devout Catholic general crossing himself in prayer, and then he and his entire staff, including James Garfield, were driven from the field in a full rout all the way back to Chattanooga. Rosecrans was defeated both mentally and physically. But in the safety of Chattanooga, Garfield was listening. From miles away, he heard what he described as orderly firing. He realized that part of the army, the left flank commanded by General George Thomas, had not broken. Garfield refused to accept defeat. He went to Rosecrans and insisted that he be allowed to ride back into the battle and find Thomas to assess the situation. Rosecrans gave permission. Garfield, with two aides, turned his horse back toward the slaughter. He began a daring ride under enemy fire, galloping across the exposed Dyer field, while Confederate sharpshooters tried to pick him off his horse. He was risking his life on the belief that the battle was not over. He later reflected, quote, "How I escaped death I do not know," end quote. Garfield found General Thomas on Snodgrass Hill. His intuition had been correct. Thomas had formed his disparate units into a desperate, horseshoe-shaped defense and was holding off the entire Confederate army. Garfield, the writer, the orator, understood the power of this moment. He sent a dispatch back to the shattered Rosecrans in Chattanooga, and in that message, he coined one of the most famous and enduring nicknames of the entire American Civil War when he reported that Thomas was standing like a rock at Chickamauga. George Thomas had performed the heroic action, saving the Army of the Cumberland from total annihilation. But it was James Garfield, the professor, who created the legend. His physical courage in making the ride and his intellectual clarity in naming the moment made him a national hero. The Battle of Chickamauga was a devastating Union defeat, the worst they experienced in the Western theater. Rosecrans, as a result, was relieved of his command. But James Garfield emerged from the disaster as a star. For his actions at the Battle of Chickamauga, he was promoted to Major General of Volunteers, and at 31 years old, he was one of the youngest officers to hold the rank. He now faced a profound choice. He was Major General Garfield, a hero with a bright military future. He could have led an army at that point. But he was also Congressman-elect Garfield, with a seat waiting for him in Washington. He was conflicted. He'd grown to love the wild life of the Army, and he felt that his duty was in the field. He traveled to Washington to meet with President Abraham Lincoln to discuss his future. The meeting provided the perfect coda to Garfield's military career. Lincoln, with his clear-eyed, unsentimental pragmatism, persuaded him to resign his commission. The president's reasoning was simple and blunt. As Garfield's election was a year old, his seat in the 38th Congress was about to begin. Lincoln reasoned that it was easier to find major generals, but not so easy to find effective Republicans for Congress, especially those with Garfield's articulate, passionate support for the Union and his first-hand knowledge of military affairs. The president understood that Garfield's brains were more valuable now on the floor of Congress, where the coming fights over Reconstruction and emancipation would be waged, than at the head of a division, a corps, or an army. Garfield accepted Lincoln's recommendation. On December 5, 1863, Major General James Garfield resigned his commission and took his seat in the House of Representatives 2 days later. His military career, which lasted just over 2 years, was over. He had entered as the quintessential political general, a professor with no experience. He left as a proven strategist, the brains of the Tullahoma Campaign, and a celebrated hero of the Battle of Chickamauga. He had proven, in the end, that his brains were his greatest weapon, and his courage was beyond doubt. Next, his battle would be in Congress, and his final, tragic post, the White House. Thanks for listening.